The fire had almost died. Wren Calloway stood in the center of the cabin and watched the last orange ember pulse behind the grate like a dying heartbeat. Outside, something that was not quite wind and not quite anything she had a word for was dismantling the world. The sound came in layers, a low freight train moan beneath a high-pitched shriek above it. Between those two frequencies, something percussive and random, like fists striking the walls from every direction at once. The single south-facing window had gone completely white with frost. The door bowed inward against its hinges in rhythmic surges, as though whatever was outside was breathing against it, testing it, learning its weaknesses. Otto lay on the bed in the corner. He hadn't moved in 40 minutes. Wren crossed to him in 4 steps. The cabin didn't allow for more, and pressed her palm to his forehead. The heat that rose against her hand was wrong. Not the warmth of a sleeping child, not even the flush of a mild fever. This was the heat of something burning from the inside, consuming itself to stay lit. His breathing came in short pulls, faster than it should, shallow in a way that made her count each one without meaning to. His eyelashes lay still against his cheeks. He did not stir at her touch. Lena sat on the floor beside the bed with her back against the frame, her knees drawn to her chest. 7 years old, and she had stopped crying sometime in the last hour. Her eyes moved to her mother's face with an expression that no child that age should have known how to wear, the expression of someone who has already calculated the odds and is waiting to learn if the calculation was wrong. Wren pulled her hand back from Otto's forehead. She turned to the stove. The ember behind the grate pulsed once more, then contracted. She had let the fire burn low that afternoon. The temperature had climbed to 35 degrees. The snow was melting in the yard. The children were laughing outside for the first time in weeks. Wren had stood in the doorway watching them and had thought, without saying it aloud, that the worst was behind them. She had let the fire drop to coals. Why waste wood on a day like that? She moved to the north wall and pulled 2 pieces of split oak from the stacked face of the interior cord. The wood was warm beneath her fingers. Not hot, not like the stove itself, not like her son's forehead, but warm the way a stone holds warmth long after the sun has moved off it. She had been stacking this wall since September. She had built it piece by piece, cord by cord, in the face of every reasonable person's objection. The wood had been soaking up heat from the stove since October, storing it in the dense grain, the way a bank holds deposits, patient, silent, indifferent to the emergency happening 3 feet away. She opened the stove door and laid the first piece across the dying coal, then the second. She knelt in front of the grate and blew slow and steady, the way her grandmother had taught her to coax fire from almost nothing. The coal caught. Wren sat back on her heels and watched the flame take hold of the oak, and thought 5 months ago she had never split a log in her life. August had come to Custer County like a fever of its own. Relentless, brilliant, the sky a blue so pale it was almost white by midday. The grass stretched in every direction without apology, rising to Wren's waist, in places hiding every rock and hole and snake that waited beneath. She had arrived on the Burlington and Missouri River line out of Lincoln. The children beside her on the wooden bench seat, Bess the milk cow loaded into the livestock car behind them. The $18 was folded in a cotton envelope inside her left boot. The land certificate was in the satchel at her feet, bearing James Calloway's name in county clerk's handwriting that was neater than anything James himself had ever produced. James had been dead for 2 months. Typhoid had taken him in June, 6 weeks after he'd filed the claim, and 3 weeks before he'd finished the cabin. He died in a rented room in Broken Bow, coughing into a flour sack cloth, holding Wren's hand with a grip that weakened by degrees over 4 days, until on the morning of the 5th day, she realized she had been holding a dead man's hand for some time without knowing it. She had arranged the burial. She had packed the children. She had taken the land certificate because it was the only thing James had left that was worth more than sentiment, and she had come west to the 160 acres he'd chosen off a surveyor's plat in a Lincoln office site unseen because there was nothing to go back to in Roanoke and nowhere else to go forward to. Wren was 31 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark brown hair she kept pinned under a cotton work bonnet during the day and braided at night, and gray eyes that her mother had once described as the color of sky before weather. She had grown up in the hill country outside Roanoke, Virginia, in a family of Scots-Irish descent that had been putting down roots in Appalachian ground since before the Revolution, people who built things to last and expected the things they built to be tested. Her hands before August of 1887 had been the hands of a woman who cooked, sewed, gardened, and managed a household with the practical competence that frontier life demanded of everyone regardless of gender. They were not the hands of someone who felled timber. They would become those hands. She did not know this yet. The cabin James had been building stood on a slight rise in the southwest corner of the claim. 12 feet by 16 feet, log walls chinked with river mud, a south-facing window that let in enough light to read by. If you stood close to it, a cast-iron stove in the northwest corner that James had hauled out from Broken Bow on a borrowed wagon. He had not finished the chinking on the north wall before he died. There were places between the logs where Wren could feel air moving, warm August air, now drifting through like a slow exhalation. She stood in the cabin the first afternoon, pressed her fingertips into one of those gaps, felt the night air moving through, and thought about January. She fed the children from the provisions she'd brought. She milked Bess. She put the children to sleep on the rope bed James had framed, but not yet strung with proper cord padding, the bare frame with her own blankets. She sat at the rough cottonwood table James had completed, the only piece of furniture he'd finished, and looked at the north wall in the dim light of the oil lamp and counted what she had. $18, 2 children, 1 cow, a cast-iron stove, an axe James had bought in Broken Bow and never used, a crosscut saw, a land claim that would require 5 years of continuous occupancy before it became legally hers. She did not sleep much that first night. The grass moved against itself outside in a constant whisper that was almost language. The stars came out in numbers she hadn't known existed somewhere to the northeast. A coyote worked through a long descending call that Otto would have found fascinating had he been awake. Wren sat at the table and listened to the prairie introduce itself and tried to calculate what she did not know how to calculate. Caleb Drummond appeared the following morning before the dew had burned off the grass. He came from the northeast, from the direction of the farm she could see from the cabin door. A proper farm, a frame house rather than a log cabin, a barn with a peaked roof, outbuildings, whose purpose she hadn't yet determined. He walked with the economy of a man who had crossed this particular ground 10,000 times. 57 years old, she would learn later. Face like weathered pine bark, the kind of weathering that takes decades and communicates all of them at once. Hands when she eventually shook one that felt like gripping a leather strap left outside through several winters. He stopped 10 feet from the cabin door and looked at the cabin. He looked at the empty expanse of ground where a woodpile should have been. He looked at Wren standing in the doorway, with her work apron still damp from washing the breakfast dishes, her brown hair covered by the cotton bonnet, her gray eyes steady. 6 cords, Caleb said. Not as an opening, as an assessment delivered to someone who needed the number before anything else. Wren waited. Minimum 6 cords of good hardwood before the first hard freeze. You know what a cord looks like. He didn't wait for her answer, which told her he already knew she didn't. 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet, 3,000 pounds of seasoned oak, maybe more. 6 cords is 18,000 pounds of wood. He paused, giving the number space to settle. You have 10 weeks before the first hard freeze, maybe 11 if October holds warm, which it won't. Wren said, "How much does wood cost to buy in Broken Bow?" Something moved in his expression, not quite respect, not quite its opposite. $2.50 a cord delivered. She did the arithmetic so fast she almost spoke the answer aloud before she stopped herself. 6 cords at $2.50 was $15. That left $3 for food, salt, lamp oil, medicine. If one of the children got sick, any emergency the prairie cared to invent between now and April. It wasn't possible. Any child could see it wasn't possible. I buried a family last February, Caleb said. The Hargroves. Young couple, a boy about 3 years old. They had 4 cords when the cold came. The husband was strong, had experience. I found all 3 of them. He stopped there. He didn't describe what he'd found. He didn't need to. Wren said, "What's the timber situation on this claim?" "Nothing on the claim itself. Nearest timber is the Loop River 5 miles east. Cottonwood and elm along the banks, some standing dead. Standing dead burns better than green." He looked at her directly for the first time. "You know how to fell a tree?" "No." "Buck a log, split rounds, seasoned green wood?" "No, no, no." Caleb looked past her into the cabin. Lena had appeared in the doorway behind Wren, silent, watching with gray-green eyes, that particular shade that seemed to absorb information. without necessarily broadcasting what it concluded. Otto was somewhere behind her, not yet visible, but audible, a low, continuous hum that meant he was occupied with something small and interesting on the floor. Caleb looked back at Wren. "A woman alone cannot cut 6 cords of timber in 10 weeks," he said. "The math doesn't allow it. Sell the claim. Take whatever Pruitt at the land office offers. It won't be fair, but it'll be enough to get you back east to people who can help." He turned and walked back toward his farm without looking back. He had delivered his verdict. His expression throughout had not been cruel. It had been something worse accurate. Wren watched him walk until he was a dark figure against the pale grass. Then she went inside, looked at the north wall of the cabin, and began to count the logs. She did not sleep that second night either. She sat at the cottonwood table after the children were down and worked the arithmetic from every angle she could find, turning the numbers over like stones looking for something useful underneath. $18. 6 cords at $2.50 each made $15. Remaining $3. 5 months of winter. 2 growing children. 1 cow that needed feed she hadn't yet sourced. The arithmetic kept returning the same answer no matter how she arranged the variables. There was no version of this that worked through conventional means. Caleb Drummond had seen it in 30 seconds. She had now spent hours confirming he was right. She stood from the table and walked to the north wall. The gap in the chinking she'd found that afternoon was at eye level between the third and fourth logs from the bottom. She pressed 2 fingers into it and felt the night air moving through, still warm, not yet urgent. She thought about January. She thought about what 40 below felt like moving through a gap she could fit 2 fingers into. Then she thought about her grandmother. Eliza Calloway had lived her whole life in a log house in the Shenandoah Valley west of Staunton, Virginia, where the Scots-Irish families had been putting down roots since before the Revolution. The house was small, smaller than this cabin, with a fireplace that smoked when the wind came from the north and walls that had survived 7 decades of mountain winters. Every autumn before the first frost, Eliza stacked firewood along the north wall of the main room. Not a wood box, not a corner pile, a wall. Floor to ceiling, 4 feet deep, running the full length of the room. Wren had spent childhood winters in that house, sleeping on a pallet near the hearth, watching her grandmother feed the fire with wood pulled from the stack that pressed against the wall like a second wall built inside the first. She had asked once why the wood was kept inside. Eliza had looked up from her mending with the expression she reserved for questions whose answers were so obvious she had to decide whether the question deserved a real answer or a short one. She gave the real one. The wood holds the warmth, keeps it for you. And when the cold comes through the wall, it has to fight through 4 feet of oak before it gets to us. She'd gone back to her mending. Then after a moment, "That's what I call the inside forest. The forest that fights for you while you sleep." Wren had been 8 years old. She had been more interested in the biscuits cooling on the hearth than in the mechanics of stacked hardwood. She had not thought about it again for 23 years. She stood now in a cabin in Nebraska, one hand pressed against a gap in the north wall, through which the August night moved warm and easy, and thought about 4 feet of oak her grandmother had always kept between herself and the cold. The north wall was 16 feet long. If she stacked wood 4 feet deep and 7 feet high, floored and near ceiling, she was looking at roughly 448 cubic feet. 3.5 cords inside the cabin. The room would shrink by a third. The children would have almost no floor space. Any neighbor who saw it would think she'd lost her mind. But if the wood held warmth, the way her grandmother said, if it absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, if it blocked the drafts that would otherwise pour through the chinking in January, then maybe 3.5 cords inside did the work of 5 cords in a conventional outdoor pile. Maybe the wall was insulation. Maybe it was a heat reservoir. Maybe it was both, and both together meant she could survive on 3 cords instead of 6. Maybe. The word was made almost entirely of uncertainty, but Caleb Drummond's arithmetic guaranteed death, and a maybe was the only alternative on offer. Wren pulled her hand away from the gap in the chinking. She went back to the table, picked up the oil lamp, and held it close to the north wall. She studied the logs, measuring with her eyes, calculating with the part of her mind that had been running numbers since childhood, without ever being formally trained to do it. 4 feet deep, 7 feet high, 16 feet long, 448 cubic feet. 1 cord equaled 128 cubic feet. She would need to fill this space 3.5 times over. She set the lamp down. She had a plan. It was the kind of plan that only looks like one when every reasonable alternative has already been ruled out, but it had a shape, and that was more than she'd had an hour ago. The Lou River was 5 miles east through grass that hid every hazard the ground could think of. Wren left before first light on the first river day, leaving Lena in charge of Auto Lena at 7, was already the kind of child you could leave in charge of things, and trust that the charge would be taken seriously, and set out with James's axe across her shoulder and the two-wheeled handcart bumping behind her through the frost-tipped grass. The dead elms stood gray and skeletal along the bank, stripped of leaves, their bark the color of old pewter. The cottonwoods beside them were alive, massive, their trunks wider than she could reach around. She chose a dead elm that looked manageable, perhaps 18 inches across at the base, leaning slightly south. The first swing glanced off the bark, and the impact traveled up the handle through her palms and wrists and into her elbows with a vibration that blurred her vision momentarily. The second swing bit in a real bite, the blade sinking an inch into the pale wood beneath the bark, but when she tried to pull it free, the blade held fast. She had to grip the handle with both hands and rock it back and forth to work it loose, stumbling backward 2 steps when it finally came free. By noon, she had cut a notch 6 inches deep on the south side of the trunk. Her palms had blistered. The blisters had burst. The handle of the axe was slick. She ate the cornbread she'd brought, drank from the river, looked at the elm. The tree looked back with complete indifference. She picked up the axe. By mid-afternoon, the tree was groaning. Then the groan became a crack. Then the crack became a roar. The elm went down in what felt like slow motion, and then suddenly, very fast, crashing through the lower branches of its neighbors with a sound like a rifle shot, repeated a dozen times, landing in the grass. With a thump, she felt through the soles of her boots. Wren sat down next to it. Her legs made the decision independently of any instruction. One tree, perhaps a tenth of a cord when split and stacked. She needed 40 trees, like at minimum. At this rate, with this body working these hours, she would have 1 cord by October. 1.5 if she pushed past what she thought her body could sustain. Caleb had said 6 minimum. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. The elm lay in the grass, entirely indifferent to her arithmetic. She picked up the crosscut saw. All right, 1/10 of a cord. Let's see if we can make it 2. Grace Whitfield came by on a Thursday morning in the second week of September. Riding a bay mare, carrying a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread, she sat on the table without ceremony. She was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, plain-spoken, in the way that Ohio had made her and Nebraska had refined. She had survived 2 Nebraska winters and spoke about them the way veterans spoke about campaigns, with a flat honesty that did not sensationalize because the facts were sufficient. She found Wren on her knees in front of the north wall with her arms stretched wide, measuring its length in splay-fingered increments. "What are you doing?" Wren explained. She kept it brief because the idea sounded less reasonable spoken aloud than it did inside her head, and she had no patience for the version of this conversation that turned into a debate she didn't have time for. Grace listened. Her expression moved through several stages, none of them encouraging. "You want to fill your house with firewood. Along the north wall, 4 feet deep, floor to ceiling." Wren. Grace set her hands on her hips, the skirt of her dark wool dress settling around her boots. "The children will have no room to move. That's 1/3 of your floor space. 1/3 of the floor space is a better problem than freezing in February. You're basing this on what your grandmother did back east decades ago." Grace shook her head. Her voice carried real concern in it, not dismissal. "Nebraska winters are not Virginia winters. My first winter here, the water in my wash basin froze while I was still using it. The cold here is a different animal." "I know." Wren sat back on her heels. "But I cannot cut 6 cords alone." Caleb Drummond is correct about that. The numbers don't add up no matter how I arrange them. So I can try this thing that might work, or I can accept the thing that definitely doesn't work, and one of those feels like giving up. Grace looked at her for a long moment, doing real calculation behind the eyes rather than simply running through objections. "You're going to do it regardless of what I say." "Yes," Grace exhaled. "Don't come crying to me when it fills the place with spiders." She picked up her bread and her mare's reins and left without offering to help. Wren hadn't expected her to. Grace had a husband. Her skepticism was earned by the winters she'd actually survived. It was the reasonable position. Wren turned back to the north wall and continued measuring. The news traveled the way news always traveled in Custer County, from farm to farm, along the invisible lines of mutual surveillance that frontier communities maintained as a matter of survival. Everyone watched everyone else, because knowing who was struggling and who was prospering was information with direct bearing on your own chances. The widow Calloway was building something strange inside her cabin. Not a wood box beside the stove, everyone had that. What the Calloway widow was doing was stacking cordwood floor to ceiling along the entire north wall, turning her living space into something between a cabin and a lumber room. The interpretations varied. Some said grief had broken something in her reasoning. Some said she was the kind of stubborn that couldn't distinguish persistence from foolishness. The consensus that formed, unspoken but unanimous, was that she would not survive her first winter, and the children would need to be placed somewhere sensible before the worst of it arrived. Reverend Amos Pell came on a Monday in early October, when the first real frost had whitened the grass overnight. He arrived on a dark bay horse and did not dismount, which told Wren the visit was official in the way that did not require the courtesies of a social call. He was 52, lean in the face, with eyes that had the particular quality of a man who believed his certainties were God's certainties, which made them non-negotiable in his view. He looked at the cabin. The north wall, visible through the open door behind Wren, had risen to 4 feet in the weeks since she'd begun split oak and elm, stacked with careful attention, each piece placed to minimize gaps, each row offset from the one below it, the way her grandmother had shown her. Pell said the community had concerns. He said it carefully, the way men who are making threats prefer to frame them as community welfare. A mother who filled her home with firewood, rather than preparing in the recognized fashion, was demonstrating a failure of judgment that the community could not ignore when children were involved. If Wren could not demonstrate before November that she was providing for Lena and Otto in a manner consistent with what a fit parent would provide, he would bring the matter before the county. The children would be placed with a family that had 2 parents and the means to see them through winter properly. The words landed in Wren's chest like stones dropped into deep water. Not because they were surprising. She had known this possibility existed, had seen it happen to other women in the county, but because hearing them spoken aloud in the October morning air made them real in a way she'd been successfully not thinking about for 2 months. They could take her children. It was legal. It happened. A widow deemed unfit, a mother whose judgment was questioned by enough right-thinking members of the community, could lose her children to the machinery of frontier charity that believed it was rescuing what it was, in fact, removing. Losing James had nearly killed her. She had survived it because the children needed surviving from her. Losing the children was a different mathematics entirely. Pell waited on his horse with the patience of a man accustomed to delivering difficult news and then waiting for the recipient to come to terms with it. He expected a certain progression, shock, protest, capitulation. Wren said, "My children will not freeze, Reverend. My husband chose this land. He died before he could work it. I will work it. The method is mine to determine." Her voice was level. Her hands behind her back had begun to shake, not from cold. "God helps those who help themselves. That's a principle I believe you've endorsed from the pulpit." Pell's lips pressed together. "We shall see what God helps and what he judges, Mrs. Calloway." He turned his horse and rode south. Wren watched him out of sight. Then she went inside, picked up the splitting maul from where it leaned against the stove, carried the next round of elm to the splitting block outside. She swung the maul. The round split clean. She stacked the halves against the north wall and went back for more. Her hands were still shaking, but the maul was heavy enough that it steadied them, gave them something to grip that was not fear. They could take her children if she failed, so she would not fail. The logic was simple. The execution was the problem she would deal with one cord at a time. The offer came on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of September, while the cottonwood leaves along the loop were just beginning to yellow at their edges. Warren Pruitt rode out from Broken Bow on a good horse, which told Wren something about him before he spoke a word. Men who rode good horses to make low offers understood that appearances were part of the negotiation. He was 50 or thereabouts, with the careful grooming of a man who conducted business outdoors, but wanted you to remember he had an office. He took his hat off when Wren came to the door, either courtesy or a calculated signal that he was not her enemy. He laid the offer out plainly: fair market value for 160 acres of Custer County grassland, The current claim improvements included payable and certified bank draft within 30 days. The number he named was not insulting. It was the closest thing to generosity the land market of 1887 could produce for a widow who needed to sell before winter locked her in. Wren looked at the number he'd written on the slip of paper. She looked at the land certificate on the table, James Calloway's name in the county clerk's deliberate hand. She thought about what James had looked like when he talked about this land, this specific 160 acres chosen from a surveyor's plat in a Lincoln office. He had talked about it the way men talked about things they intended to make permanent. He had chosen it with the conviction of someone who plans to give something to his children. He had died before he saw it. Wren folded the slip of paper and held it back across the threshold toward Pruitt. Her voice carried nothing that could be mistaken for drama. "Thank you for coming out. The answer is no." Pruitt took the paper with the expression of a man who had predicted this response, found it confirmed, and was filing it under women who would require rescuing in February. He replaced his hat, turned his horse, rode south without argument. He had other claims to pursue. He could afford to wait. Wren stood in the doorway until the horse was a dark punctuation mark against the pale grass. Then she went back to the north wall and picked up the splitting maul. She did not examine the decision further. James had chosen this ground. He had died before it became what he'd imagined. She would not let him die for nothing, which meant she would not sell. Which meant the only question remaining was how to survive the winter she had just committed herself to facing. October arrived with a cold that had no patience for the pretense of autumn. The mornings came dark, the frost thick on the grass, the water bucket requiring real effort to break through by the third week of the month. She had developed a system for the Loup River runs that reduced wasted motion to a minimum, because wasted motion in the framework she was operating under was the same as wasted time, which was the same as cord feet of wood she wouldn't have when February arrived. She left before first light on river days, the handcart wheels cutting twin lines through the frosted grass. At the river, she worked until the cart was loaded. 200 pounds of split elm was the maximum the cart's wheel assembly could manage without threatening to fail, then started the return. 5 miles of pulling 200 pounds through uneven ground took between 2 and 3 hours, depending on what the ground had hidden for her. Holes, rocks, frozen ruts from cattle that had passed through in September. The grass gone from gold to a brittle gray-brown concealed every one of them. The routine had the grinding regularity of something that had always been true. 3 days a week she walked to the river. 3 days she split and stacked. Sundays she rested because she had concluded without sentiment that a body that never stopped working would stop on its own schedule and at a moment of its own choosing, which was worse. She lost weight she did not have to lose. The hollow places in her face deepened. Her arms developed ropey cables of muscle visible when she pushed up her flannel sleeves to work at the splitting block. Her palms went through 3 stages, blistered, then cracked, then hardened into something that could grip a wet axe handle in sub-freezing temperatures without slipping. The wall grew. By the second week of October, it had reached 5 feet along the full 16-foot length of the north face. Lena measured it each afternoon with a seriousness that was her way of participating in something she understood was important without fully understanding why. She had her mother's eye for structure, an instinct for how pieces fit together, and she stacked the smaller splits with an architect's precision, finding gaps and filling them with pieces turned at angles that tightened the wall without wasting a cubic inch. Otto measured the wall too, though his measurements were less reliable because he kept adding the height of his own head to whatever he found on the grounds that he was part of the wall project and should be counted. Wren did not correct this reasoning. It was not wrong in any way that mattered. The wheel broke on the 22nd of October. She was 3 miles from the cabin on the return leg, the cart loaded with a full haul of split elm, moving through a section of ground where the grass had died back enough to see the surface. She saw the rock a half second before the wheel found it, a flat limestone shelf jutting up through the topsoil at an angle that caught the right wheel's leading edge at exactly the wrong point in its rotation. The spoke snapped with a sound like a rifle shot in the cold air. The hub cracked along a grain she hadn't known was compromised. The cart tipped right and dropped 200 pounds of split elm onto the frozen ground. Wren stood and looked at the scattered wood. She looked at the broken wheel. She looked at the 3 miles between herself and the cabin where Lena was watching Otto. She sat down on the cold ground beside the overturned cart, put her face in her hands and wept. Not for the wheel, not for the wood lying in the frost around her. She wept for James, who had bought this axe and this cart and this saw with money they hadn't easily had and had died before he used any of them properly. She wept for Lena, who had stopped playing the way 7-year-olds played because she understood that the cabin was a serious place now, and seriousness was what was required of her. She wept for Otto, who asked questions without stopping, because questions were his way of keeping the world from becoming frightening, and she could hear in the frequency of his questions exactly how frightened he was. She wept for herself, 31 years old, 112 pounds, 3 miles from her children, on a frozen Nebraska plain with a broken cart and 4 hours of work spread across the ground around her. The tears were not a luxury she had permitted herself since June. They came now the way a debt comes when deferred too long all at once, without negotiation taking what was owed. When they stopped, the sun was lower. The cold was settling in with the specific, purposeful quality it developed in the hour before dark in late October. Wren wiped her face on her sleeve. She looked at the wood. She could carry some of it in her arms and cache the rest, then walk home, repair the wheel, and return tomorrow for what she'd left. She stood up. Her legs were stiff. Her back had moved beyond discomfort into a register she no longer had a precise word for. She began sorting through the scattered wood smaller pieces she could carry under one arm, leaving the heaviest rounds for retrieval. She made a rough stack she could find again, marking it in her mind against the limestone shelf that had caused this. Then she started walking. The walk home took an hour and 40 minutes. Lena had supper started when she arrived, a pot of cornmeal mush with the last of the salt pork cut into it, steam rising in the lamplight. Wren sat down at the cottonwood table and looked at what her daughter had made and could not speak for a moment. Lena brought her a bowl without being asked. Otto climbed onto the bench beside her, pressed his small shoulder against her arm, and began explaining something about a bug he had found under the stove. A remarkable bug of particular interest whose specific details required considerable elaboration. Wren ate the mush. She listened to the bug's biography. She let her daughter's competence and her son's chatter be the things they were evidence, both of them, that she had kept them alive this far. After they were asleep, she assessed the wheel by lamplight. The spoke was a clean break, replaceable if she had the right wood. The hub crack was more serious. She packed it with pine tar from the supply James had laid in for cabin maintenance, bound it tight with wire from the fence post supplies in the corner, fashioned a replacement spoke from a straight-grained piece of cottonwood she split down to the right dimensions. The cottonwood was green. It would not hold indefinitely. It would hold long enough if she didn't push the cart beyond its new reduced limits. She worked until midnight. Then she went to bed because tomorrow she had wood to retrieve. On the morning of the third day after the wheel broke, Wren was preparing to make the return trip to the cached elm when she saw the wagon. It appeared on the northern horizon the way things appeared on the Nebraska plain, as an abstraction. First, a dark shape that could be anything, resolving slowly into specificity as it drew closer. Caleb Drummond's draft horses. Caleb Drummond's wagon bed. Caleb Drummond himself on the seat, driving with the relaxed authority of a man who had been handling big horses for decades. He pulled up beside the cabin and set the brake. In the wagon bed, stacked with the geometric precision of someone who understood that correctly stacked wood was denser wood, half a cord of seasoned oak. Not fresh cut, not green cottonwood from the river. Pale gray, the color wood achieved after a full season of proper drying. The color that meant it would catch fast, burn hot, hold its heat longer than anything she'd managed to cut herself. Wren looked at the wood. She looked at Caleb. His expression offered nothing beyond the fact of his presence. "I have more than I need," he told her. "Consider it a trade. Your eggs come April." She had 6 hens. In April, 6 hens would be producing. 2 dozen eggs was a reasonable valuation for half a cord of seasoned oak delivered to her door, and they both understood it, and neither of them said so. She said 2 dozen in April. Agreed. He climbed down from the wagon and began unloading with the efficiency of a man who moved wood, the way some men move money quickly, without wasted motion. Each piece placed exactly where it belonged. Wren moved to help him. He waved her back with a gesture that was not unkind, but was absolute. "You look like a stiff wind would knock you over. Let me do it." She stepped back. She watched him work, and because she was watching carefully, she noticed the thing his face did when he moved the wood, a kind of settling, like a man returning to something familiar that he'd been away from long enough to half forget. When the wagon bed was empty, he straightened. put both hands on the small of his back, looked at the cabin. "Show me," he said. She let him inside. The north wall had reached 6 feet by then, running the full 16-foot length close enough to the ceiling that she'd had to angle the top course to fit under the rafters. The living space remaining was compressed intimate, a cave rather than a room, warm in a way that hit you when you came in from outside, the warmth of accumulated heat that had nowhere to escape. Caleb stood in front of the wall for a long time. His expression did not announce what it was thinking. Then he extended one hand and pressed his palm flat against the stacked face of the oak. He held it there for what Wren counted as 10 seconds. "Warm," he said. One word delivered with the weight of a man recalibrating something he'd believed he understood. He was quiet for another moment. "My grandmother did something like this. Back in Vermont. I'd forgotten." He pulled his hand back. He did not elaborate on the grandmother or what he'd forgotten or what it meant that he was remembering it now. He turned to the door. "January is the real test. December is for beginners. If you make it to February with fuel left, we'll know." He walked out. The wagon moved north across the frozen grass and grew small against the sky. Wren turned back to the wall. She pressed her own palm against it in the place where his hand had been, checking that the warmth he'd found was still there. The wood was warm. It was always warm now. The stove ran through the day. The wood absorbed what the room produced at night. When the fire dropped, it gave the heat back slowly, the way a good well gives water steadily without drama, from a depth that took time to build. She thought, "Every person who has told me I will fail has believed it completely. They have not been lying. They have been reading the same arithmetic and arriving at the same conclusion because the arithmetic they're reading is the only arithmetic they know." The thought did not feel like triumph. It felt like responsibility. November came in behind a northwest wind that had no give in it. The temperature dropped below zero for the first time. On the 8th, recovered briefly, dropped again on the 12th, and stayed. Frost formed on the interior walls, the east wall, the west wall, the places where the chinking had cracked, but not on the north wall. The north wall, behind its 4 feet of stacked oak, stayed dry, stayed warm. She pressed her palm to it every morning the way she checked Otto's forehead for fever. A daily verification the system was working. The wood was holding the theory her dead grandmother had given her 23 years ago in a Virginia hill country house had survived its first real testing. Not on feeling, on the evidence of her own 2 hands pressed against oak that stayed warm, while the temperature outside dropped toward numbers that had no reference point in her Virginia experience. She had 3 cords now, 2 inside along the north wall, 1 outside in a conventional stack on the south side of the cabin where it was accessible, protected from the prevailing northwest winds by the cabin itself. 3 cords. Caleb had said 6 minimum. She had run his numbers again in November when she had enough experience of the wall's behavior to add new variables to the calculation. The wall was reducing her consumption. She was burning less wood per night than she'd budgeted in September because the room retained heat longer than an uninsulated space. How much less she couldn't quantify precisely. But she could feel the difference in the weight of the wood she pulled from the stack each morning versus what she had planned for. Maybe 3 was enough, maybe not. January would tell her. December arrived like a professional, no theatrics, no announcement. Simply a ratcheting down of temperature to levels that redefined the word cold. 15 below on Christmas morning, 20 below by the 27th. On the last day of the year, the thermometer Grace Whitfield had nailed to her south-facing barn wall read 23 below at midday, and her husband refused to take the horses from the barn for any reason. Wren's cabin held. The water bucket did not freeze solid despite being only a few feet from the stove, a detail she tracked with scientific attention, because a frozen water bucket meant the ambient temperature had dropped below the stove's ability to maintain the room. The children slept through the nights without waking from cold. The north wall, when she pressed her palm to it each morning, gave back the same steady warmth it had been accumulating since October. Word came that the Pedersen family 12 miles west was running short. They had cut 4 cords in the fall, which should have been sufficient, but December had run harder than anyone expected. Word came that Colt Harrigan, a bachelor homesteader, 26 years old, who had taken up a claim 2 miles east of Wren's, was doing well better than well. He had cut 7 cords of oak and elm in the fall, working from September through November with the energy of a young man who had no one to watch. 7 cords for one man was enough to survive 2 winters. He had done everything correctly by every standard anyone in Custer County had for what correctly meant. Wren heard about Harrigan's 7 cords from Grace Whitfield, who mentioned it the way people mentioned evidence they thought was relevant. Wren acknowledged it the way she acknowledged weather reports as information filed and noted nothing more. She had 3 cords. She would know by February whether 3 was enough. January began with a blizzard on the 3rd that kept everyone indoors for 3 days. The snow came in horizontal, driven by a northwest wind that pressed against the cabin's south wall in sustained rhythmic waves. The door leaked cold along its bottom edge until she rolled a blanket tight and pushed it against the gap. The south window frosted completely on the first night and did not clear for the duration. The north wall showed no frost, no cold draft. Complete silence while the east and west walls creaked and ticked with the temperature differential. When the blizzard passed on the 6th, she took stock. She had burned less than she'd expected. The wall had given back heat through the 3 days of worse cold more consistently than the stove alone could have managed. She did a rough calculation based on what she'd consumed versus what remained subtracted, what she estimated she needed for February, and arrived at a number that was for the first time since August slightly better than the worst case. Slightly. Not comfortably, but slightly. On the 7th, she allowed herself something she had refused since September, a small conditional hope. Not confidence, not certainty. A hypothesis still requiring experimental confirmation that she might be approaching this correctly. January 11th arrived warm. Not spring warm, not even coat weather warm, but 35 degrees, which after the sustained cold of December felt like a message from a different season. The snow that had accumulated since the 3rd began to melt at the edges. Puddles formed in the low spots of the yard. Wren opened the south-facing window for 20 minutes mid-morning to let fresh air move through the cabin. She let the children outside after lunch. They had been indoors since the 3rd 8 days, and the confinement had compressed something in them that needed releasing. Lena ran the perimeter of the yard twice, which was not something Lena typically did, but 8 days of interior space had apparently recalibrated what running seemed like. Otto found a patch of half-melted snow and began an architectural project involving sticks and a shallow channel he was attempting to direct toward the water trough. Wren stood in the doorway in her wool dress and heavy work coat and watched them. The sky was pale blue, the sun low but present, throwing long shadows across the yard. She let the fire drop to a low burn. Why waste wood on a day like this? The cabin was warm from the walls' stored heat. The temperature outside was 35 degrees. The children were laughing for the first time in over a week. This was the thing she could not have known because no one had told her, because the people who knew it had learned it through loss and were not always alive afterward to pass the lesson on. The children's blizzard, which would kill 235 people across Nebraska and Dakota Territory the following day, was preceded by exactly this. A warm break in January temperatures climbing above freezing children running outside in the mud. The warmth was not a sign that the worst was over. It was the mechanism by which the worst was made possible, the humidity it put back into the air. The temperatures it convinced people to stop maintaining the wood. It persuaded people to stop burning. But Wren did not know this yet. At 2 in the afternoon, she stepped outside to call the children in for a rest. The sky to the northwest was the same pale blue it had been all day. She was looking northwest when it changed. The change was not subtle, but it was fast enough that subtle would not have mattered. A dark line formed along the northwest horizon, not a cloud bank, not a weather front, in any configuration she had a name for. A wall. A solid black mass rising from the edge of the visible world with a vertical face that had no gradation, no leading edge of gray before the dark. It simply existed, and it was moving, and the speed at which it moved across the flat Nebraska ground was wrong in a way that registered in her body before her mind had finished processing what she was seeing. The grass in the middle distance was already flat, not bending flat, pressed down as though something enormous had passed over it. The remaining snow on the north-facing slopes was lifting off the ground in long horizontal ribbons. Something cold moved through Wren's chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. Lena, Otto, inside, right now. Lena looked up from whatever she'd been doing. She saw her mother's face, not the horizon. She couldn't yet see the horizon from where she stood, and she moved. That was the thing about Lena. She read her mother the way some children read weather, with an accuracy that required no explanation. Otto protested. He had a very important hydraulic project in progress. Wren's voice did not repeat. It simply waited with a quality in it that Otto understood was not negotiable. He abandoned the hydraulics. They were inside with the door closed when the wind shifted. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the time it took Wren to throw the latch. She stood with her back against the door and listened to the change moving through the cabin, a faint draft finding the east wall gap, the stove's draft pulling harder, the air itself seeming to contract as the pressure shifted. Outside, something that had been distant and moving fast was suddenly close. Then it arrived. The sound was not like any storm Wren had previously experienced because she had previously experienced storms as weather events, things that happened above and around you. This arrived as a physical impact. The cabin's south wall took at first a concussive pressure that made the logs groan. The window rattled in its frame with a violence she could see from across the room. The door which she had just latched bowed inward against its frame, like something alive was pressing from outside, learning the weakness of the latch. Otto screamed. It was not a sound he made often. He was not a screaming child which made it land harder than it would have from a more theatrical child. Wren crossed to him in 3 steps, gathered him against her, reached for Lena with her other arm, moved them both toward the center of the cabin, away from the window, away from the door, toward the stove, toward the north wall. The temperature inside was already dropping. She could feel it on her face, on the back of her neck. The fire she had let burn low all afternoon, the fire she had reduced because 35 degrees didn't require burning wood you might need in February, was not equal to what was now being asked of it. She released the children and crossed to the stove. She pulled the door open. The coals were there, not dead, not yet, but low-banked, operating at a fraction of the output the cabin now required. She reached for the wood beside the stove, the conventional pile she kept there for daily use. 3 pieces. She had not restocked it during the warm afternoon because she hadn't been burning much. 3 pieces. She turned to the north wall. The exterior stacked the 1 cord she had kept outside on the south side of the cabin, as her emergency reserve was already inaccessible. She understood this the moment she felt the door bow inward. The temperature had dropped far enough fast enough that the moisture in the air around the doorframe had turned to ice in the time it took to close. She pressed the latch twice. The door was sealed. She pulled pieces from the interior face of the north wall. The wood came away warm in her hands, not room temperature, not the neutral cool of ambient air, but genuinely warm, carrying in its grain the accumulated heat of 3 months' worth of days beside a stove. She laid 2 pieces across the coals. She knelt and blew slow and even, the way her grandmother had shown her. The coals caught the 2nd piece on the 3rd breath. She sat back on her heels and felt something clarify in her understanding of what she had built. The wall was not insulation alone. It was not simply a barrier against the drafts that moved through the north chinking. It was a reserve, a stockpile she could reach without opening the door, without exposing herself to whatever was outside, for even the duration of a step across a threshold. The wood she was burning right now had been inside this cabin since October. She had touched every piece of it with her own hands. It was here in this room, accessible from where she stood. Every cord she had stacked outside was under whatever was happening out there right now. Unreachable, buried or drifting or in the process of becoming part of a landscape that bore no relationship to the yard she had walked through 4 hours ago. She thought about Colt Harrigan 2 miles east, with his 7 cords stacked against the south wall of his cabin. Young, strong Colt Harrigan, who had done everything right. She thought about what 7 cords of wood looked like under 4 feet of driven snow in a temperature that had no name yet, the combination of cold and wind that would not be formally measured and labeled for another 60 years. And she thought about the distance between that wood and the inside of a cabin. The difference between wood you can reach and wood you cannot reach is not a difference of degree. It is the only difference that matters. She fed 3 more pieces into the stove. The cabin temperature stabilized somewhere she could not precisely measure, but could feel cold enough that Otto's breath fogged warm enough that the water bucket's surface had not yet filmed. The north wall, when she pressed her palm against it between loads of wood, was still giving back heat, still holding what it had gathered across 3 months of ordinary days. The wind found every weakness the cabin had ever hidden. It found the gap in the east wall chinking that Wren had patched in September with fresh river mud, the patch now contracting in the sudden cold, pulling away from the logs in the way that mud did when temperature dropped faster than materials could accommodate. It found the space around the stovepipe where it passed through the roof, a gap she had stuffed with rags in October, that the vibration of the storm was working loose by degrees. It found the south window's frame, the putty James had applied in haste before he got sick. The north wall was silent. Not quiet, the distinction mattered. The east wall produced sounds, the low moan of cold air, finding purchase the occasional sharp tick of a log contracting faster than the one beside it. The west wall made similar noises. The north wall, behind its 4 feet of stacked oak, made no sound at all. It absorbed the storm's pressure the way deep water absorbs a stone completely, without response, as though the storm were not a relevant fact. Wren fed the stove with the steady attention of someone managing a negotiation that could not be interrupted. 2 pieces every 20 minutes. She had counted the accessible face of the interior wall by touch and estimated she had enough to run the stove at this rate for 11 days. She would not need 11 days. She needed one night. Otto had stopped crying. He sat on the bed with the quilts piled around him to his chin, his face flushed with a color that Wren watched with the sidelong attention of a woman who could not afford to look directly at what frightened her most. Lena sat beside him, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, maintaining the particular stillness of a child who has decided that calm is a thing she can provide even when she does not feel it. The cabin temperature held at something Wren estimated as 50 degrees, cold enough to see breath, warm enough that the water bucket's surface had not yet hardened. At 8 o'clock, Otto made a sound that was different from the sounds he'd been making. Not a cry, not the shallow, too-fast breathing she'd been counting. A different kind of sound, involuntary, the sound a body makes when something in it has shifted without the mind's instruction. She crossed to the bed in 2 steps. His forehead under her palm was wrong, not the dry heat of the afternoon which had been concerning. This was wetter, more urgent, the heat of something working past its own limits. His eyes, when he opened them, focused on her face, with the slightly delayed quality of someone seeing through gauze. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Mama, I'm cold." He was burning. She could feel the heat radiating off him from 6 inches away. His complaint was not confusion, it was the paradox of high fever, the body generating so much heat that it exhausted its own reserves, leaving the person inside the furnace shivering. Wren pulled the quilts closer. She went to the water bucket, dipped the washing cloth, wrung it until it stopped dripping, folded it, laid it across his forehead. She had willow bark in the medicine box under the bed, a strip she'd peeled from a river willow in October against exactly this kind of need. She crushed a portion of it between 2 rocks, steeped it in the warmest water the bucket could provide, strained it through a cloth into the tin cup. She held Otto's head up and got him to drink most of it, which required patience. She extracted from a reserve she hadn't known she was maintaining. Lena watched all of this with the gray-green eyes that saw everything and announced nothing. When Wren had settled Otto back onto the pillow, Lena said with the flatness of someone stating a logistical fact rather than asking a question, "Is he going to be all right?" Wren met her daughter's eyes, 7 years old, and the question carried the weight of someone who had already considered the alternative. "Yes," Wren told her, "yes, he is." She said it the way she fed the stove, with complete commitment to the action, setting aside the uncertainty until later. "I need you to sleep if you can. I'll watch him." Lena lay down beside her brother without argument. She curled her body around his smaller one, her arm across his chest, her face against the back of his neck. Wren watched her daughter make herself into a source of warmth for her brother in the most direct way available to her, and felt something move through her chest that she had no word large enough to contain. The storm's voice changed around midnight. It had been a roar since it arrived, a sustained foundational sound that stopped being individually perceptible after the first hour, the way a waterfall stops being individually perceptible, becoming instead simply the condition of the environment. At midnight, it shifted in pitch, dropping from the roar into something lower, more deliberate. The gusts, which had been continuous, became intermittent, longer builds followed by harder strikes. The cabin registered each strike as a full-body experience, the logs flexing against their joints, the roof boards pressing down on the rafters, the entire structure having a conversation with the wind about how much it was willing to concede. The answer so far was nothing. Wren sat in the chair beside the stove with a wool shawl around her shoulders, and Otto in her peripheral vision watching the rise and fall of the quilt over his chest, doing the arithmetic of his respiration, the way she had done the arithmetic of the woodpile counting, comparing to baseline noting deviation. His breathing was faster than normal. Not as fast as it had been at 8 o'clock. The willow bark was doing what willow bark did, which was not enough, but was what she had. She fed the stove. At 3 in the morning, the smoke came. It happened without warning and without precedent in her experience of the stove's behavior. One moment the draft was pulling normally. The next gray smoke was rolling from the gap around the stove door in a thick, purposeful wave. The wind outside had found the chimney's top the angle of a particular gust, the pressure differential it created, and reversed the draft, completely pushing everything back down. The smoke hit Wren's eyes before she understood what was happening. She moved on instinct before analysis away from the stove, toward the children, getting her body between the smoke and the bed. Lena. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had a specific quality she had never deliberately cultivated, but had apparently developed a frequency that reached her daughter through sleep. Lena was awake before the second syllable. What happened next, Wren would not fully reconstruct until the following day, when she had the distance to think about it clearly. Lena had already pulled Otto toward the floor before Wren reached the bed. Not toward the floor in the random way of a startled child, toward the floor on the side of the bed, farthest from the stove, away from the smoke source, in the specific way of someone who had stored information her mother had given her in October. They had talked about fire behavior once briefly practically while stuffing the roof gap rags. Wren had mentioned that smoke rose, that in a fire you move down. She had not thought Lena was listening with the retention necessary to act on it under duress at 3 in the morning. Lena had the wet cloth from the washstand pressed over Otto's face before Wren reached them. Wren covered Lena's face with the second cloth from her apron pocket. She covered her own nose and mouth with her sleeve. They lay on the floor of the cabin in the dark 3 feet below the smoke layer that filled the upper half of the room and waited. 4 minutes. Wren counted them in the same units she used for everything. Stove pieces, cord feet, days until spring. 4 minutes on the floor while the wind continued its assault on the chimney and the smoke filled the space above them and the cold pressed through every gap the cabin had. 4 minutes is a long time when you are counting it on the floor in the dark with 2 children under your arms. Then the wind shifted. The sound of it changed fractionally, a quarter turn in direction, the pressure differential reversing, and the draft came back. Not gradually. The chimney took the smoke in a rush, the column of gray reversing upward with visible urgency. Within 2 minutes, the air at floor level was breathable. Within 5, the room was clear enough to stand. Wren stood. She checked the children. She checked the stove. She added 2 pieces of oak from the north wall, the wood warm in her hands. Even now, even in this, and set the damper to reduce the draw slightly, which she should have done hours ago and had not thought to do, because this particular failure mode had not been part of her preparation. She filed that. She would not forget it. Otto was coughing weakly, more reflex than distress. Lena was sitting up on the floor with her knees drawn to her chest, looking at the stove with an expression that was evaluating rather than frightened. Wren knelt beside her. She put her hand on her daughter's head, felt the cool normalcy of her temperature, the steady warmth of a healthy child rather than the alarming heat of a sick one. She said, her voice steady, "You did right. You did exactly right." Lena nodded once, accepting this as data rather than praise. Then she asked with the practicality that was her primary mode of operation, "Is the smoke done?" "For now." "Then I'm going back to sleep." She lay back down beside Otto, resettled the quilts, closed her eyes. Wren sat in the chair and watched both of them until their breathing synchronized into the slower rhythm of sleep. Then she turned back to the stove and continued the work of keeping them alive. The cold outside reached its depths somewhere in the hours between 3 and 5. She could not measure it. The thermometer was nailed to the exterior south wall, unreachable, but she could measure it in the cabin's behavior. The west wall produced a new sound, a low, sustained groan that had not been part of its repertoire before midnight. The frost on the interior surface of the east wall thickened visibly between her checks. The water bucket, which had held a liquid surface through the evening, filmed over sometime around 4. The north wall showed nothing. No frost, no groaning, no new sounds. It sat in the cabin's compressed darkness and did what it had been doing since October held what it had been given. Wren was not a woman who trafficked in abstraction, but sitting in the chair at 4 in the morning, with the storm at its worst outside, and the stove working steadily, and the two children breathing in the corner, she arrived at a thought that was as close to philosophy as she generally got. The wall had taken all summer to imagine all fall, to build all winter to test. Every person she respected had told her it was wrong. She had built it anyway, not because she was certain they were mistaken, but because their certainty guaranteed an outcome she was not willing to accept. The willingness to be wrong about something difficult was not the same as confidence. It was something older, the recognition that doing nothing certain was not better than doing something uncertain, when the certain path led to a place you already knew you could not live with. She had been wrong about the damper. She had been wrong to let the fire drop on the 11th. She had probably been wrong about things she hadn't yet discovered. But she was here in this chair in this cabin with those two children breathing in the corner. She fed the stove 2 more pieces and did not let herself think past the next 20 minutes. At 5 in the morning, Otto's breathing changed. Wren heard it before she consciously identified what she was hearing, a shift in the rhythm, the shallow pulls lengthening into something deeper, slower, more sustainable. She was at the bedside before her mind had finished processing the signal. She pressed her palm to his forehead. The heat was going, not gone, but going receding by degrees from the alarming register of the night into something that was merely elevated, the body stepping back from the edge of its own excess. His color, even in the dim lamp glow, had shifted from the hectic red of high fever towards something that still wasn't right, but was pointing in a better direction. His eyes opened. They focused on her face with the latency of someone returning from a long distance. He blinked twice with the deliberateness of someone verifying that what they saw was accurate. His voice came out dry, reduced, but present. "Mama, I'm thirsty." She gave him water. He drank with the focused attention of someone who had been very thirsty for a long time without having the capacity to register it. He finished the cup. He held it out. She refilled it. He drank half of that. "Then can I have bread?" Not a question, a statement of intent, his natural grammar reasserting itself over the politeness that illness had temporarily installed. Wren's chest did something she did not try to manage or contain. She laughed. It came out rough, half-broken, carrying in it everything she had held together since 3 in the afternoon of the previous day, releasing now through the only valve available. She pressed her hand over her mouth. She breathed. She got control of herself. She cut bread. She scraped the last of the butter from the crock. She brought it to him and sat on the edge of the bed while he ate with the single-minded efficiency of a 5-year-old who had recently been very sick and was now done with being sick and intended to return to normal operations immediately. Lena woke when she heard him eating. She looked at her brother for 3 seconds doing whatever calculation she needed to do. Then she looked at her mother. Whatever she saw in Wren's face was apparently sufficient because she nodded a small private nod, addressed to no one in particular, the gesture of someone whose hypothesis has been confirmed, and lay back down. Outside, the storm continued. It would continue until morning. But something in the cabin had shifted in a way that had nothing to do with temperature or wind speed. The worst of it, the worst of all of it, not just the storm had passed. At 8 o'clock on the morning of January 13th, the wind stopped. The cessation was so complete that the silence that replaced it was physically disorienting. Wren had been living inside the sound of the storm for 17 hours. The silence arrived like a room that was suddenly empty of furniture, the same space completely different. She could hear the stove's fire. She could hear Otto's breathing. She could hear from somewhere outside the creak of something settling after long stress. She went to the door. The ice in the frame had spent the night thickening, and what had required force to break the previous morning now required her full body weight. Both hands braced against the frame, throwing herself against the seal twice before it cracked. The door swung outward, and the cold came in. Not the violent cold of the storm. Not a cold that was trying to do something, just cold. The settled, passive cold of a world that had exhausted itself. The yard was unrecognizable. The drifts had height and specific geometry formed by the wind's logic rather than gravity's pressing against the cabin's walls in sculpted formations that in places reached the eave line. The space where the yard had been was a continuous white surface, interrupted only by the peak of the barn roof, which protruded from the drift like the back of a half-buried animal. She walked around this cabin, her boots breaking through the crust, with each step her breath forming clouds that hung in the still air before dispersing. She turned the south corner. The conventional cord she had stacked against the south wall, her emergency reserve, her fallback, the wood she had kept outside, precisely because it was supposed to be accessible in a crisis, was gone. Not visible. Not reduced. Gone, subsumed into the drift that had built against the south wall, until the wall itself was barely visible above the white. She stood and looked at it. If she had relied on that wood last night, if the interior wall had not existed, if she had built the conventional pile and kept the conventional plan, she would have needed to reach this cord sometime during the night. She would have opened the door into the storm. She would have stepped out into what was killing people across two territories for wood that was not reachable because it was under 6 feet of driven snow. She stood in the cold morning air for a long time, looking at the place where the wood was buried. The sun was up pale and without warmth, throwing long shadows across a landscape that looked like it had been made by a different planet's weather. Everything had the crystalline quality of extreme cold, the ice on the cabin's east wall catching light and throwing it back in small prismatic bursts. The surface of the drift sheened with a hardness that would take a tool to break. The north wall of the cabin showed nothing. Where the east and west walls were sheathed in a quarter-inch of clear ice from the moisture the storm had driven against them, the north wall was bare wood. The interior mass had held enough heat in the logs themselves to prevent the ice from forming. She completed the circuit. She went back inside. Otto was sitting up eating the rest of last night's bread. Lena was at the table with her primer, running her finger along a line of text with the focused expression she brought to things she intended to master. The stove was burning steadily. The north wall stood in the compressed space of the cabin, reduced by several inches across its face from the wood she had burned through the night, but present, still substantial, still warm when she pressed her hand to it out of the habit she had formed in October. She sat down at the table. She put her face in her hands, not to cry. She was beyond crying, had moved through it sometime in the night, and come out the other side into a country that was quieter, but simply to be still for a moment in the privacy that her own cupped hands provided. Caleb Drummond came on the afternoon of the 14th. He came alone on horseback rather than wagon, which told her before he dismounted that this was not a delivery. His face had aged since she'd last seen it, not in the way faces aged over years, but in the way a face aged over a single night of finding things it hadn't expected to find. He stood in the doorway and looked at the cabin's interior, the stove, the children, the wall reduced but standing with an expression that was doing several kinds of accounting at once. He told her about Colt Harrigan, the way men of his generation delivered hard information directly without ornament, trusting the listener to handle the weight of the facts without cushioning. Colt had 7 cords stacked against the south wall of his cabin. The wood was well seasoned, correctly split, everything that wood needed to be. When the storm hit, the temperature dropped faster than his interior supply could compensate for. He went out to reach the exterior pile sometime in the night. The exact time was unknown. The distance between his door and the stack was measured afterward at 31 feet. They found him at 18 feet. His hand was extended toward the pile. He had 6.5 cords of wood when he died of cold. Caleb said it plainly without the editorial that a lesser man might have added. He said the facts, 18 feet, his hand outstretched. Wren sat with this for a moment. She thought about Colt Harrigan, a young man she had never met, but had heard described as the kind the frontier produced when it produced its best version. Capable, prepared, willing to do the work without complaint. She thought about 31 feet of distance between a door and a woodpile, and what 31 feet looked like in 40 below wind, with driven snow horizontal at 50 miles per hour. She thought about 6.5 cords under 6 feet of packed drift. She thought about how the difference between Colt Harrigan's 7 cords and her 3 was not the difference between sufficient and insufficient. It was the difference between wood you had to go outside to get and wood that was already inside the room where you were standing. Caleb was looking at the north wall. He walked to it without asking permission. He pressed his palm against the stacked face the way he had in November, the same gesture, the same duration. When he pulled his hand back, he stood looking at where his hand had been. He was stronger than you, Caleb said. Not cruelly, as a simple fact. He'd cut twice the wood. He was 26 years old, and he did everything I would have told him to do because it was everything I knew to tell him. He turned to look at her directly with the eyes of a man in the process of revising something he had believed without question for 13 years. You didn't do it right, You did it different. He paused. The space between those two sentences held everything. You're alive. The silence after that held everything. Neither of them said his verdict in August. The words sell the turn back the walk across the grass. She did not reach for those things. They were accurate to what he'd known then, and he was here now, and that was what mattered. I was wrong to tell you to leave, Caleb said, not looking at her. I've been wrong before. I'll be wrong again. But I was wrong about this. He moved to the door. I'll bring the eggs in April, he said, which was not what he'd agreed to, but she understood what he was actually saying. He left. Reverend Pell came 3 days later. He arrived on foot, which was unusual for a man who owned a serviceable horse. He was carrying his hat in both hands. He stood at the open door of the cabin and looked inside the children at the table, the stove burning the north wall, and his expression was the expression of a man who has prepared a speech and arrived at the moment to deliver it only to find that the words he prepared do not fit the room he is standing in. He said the Methodist church building at the edge of Broken Bow had suffered a partial roof collapse under the snow load. He was without a warm place to work until repairs were made. He said this to the middle distance between himself and the far wall, rather than to Wren directly. She looked at him for a moment. 52 years old, the man who had threatened to take her children in October, standing in her doorway in January with his hat in his hands. She had thought about this man in the night during the storm, had thought about Lena, about what it would have meant to stand in an empty cabin, knowing Lena was somewhere in Broken Bow with a family that had 2 parents but did not have Lena's mother. Come in, Reverend. There's tea. He came in. He sat in the chair she indicated. She put the pot on. He looked at the north wall with the sustained attention of a man seeing something for the first time that he should have seen before. He did not apologize. She had not expected an apology. Men of his particular formation demonstrated revision through action, not through the words the action replaced. The action in this case was sitting in the chair she'd offered him, accepting the tea she poured, and not saying a single word about the children or their placement or the fitness of their mother. That silence was the apology, the only form it would take, and she received it as the form it was. He stayed 2 hours. He drank 2 cups of tea. Otto told him at considerable length about the hydraulic project that the storm had interrupted in the yard, its current status, its projected completion timeline, the specific engineering challenges involved. Pell listened to this with the expression of a man who has not recently spent time with 5-year-olds but is finding the experience unexpectedly restorative. When he left, he shook Wren's hand. Not a social shake, a deliberate one. The grip of a man acknowledging something he couldn't put into words available to him in January of 1888 in Custer County, Nebraska. She shook it back with the calloused hand of a woman who had cut 3 cords of timber alone and built a wall that the winter had tested and not broken. Grace Whitfield came on the 28th. She brought a dried apple pie and the expression of a woman who has been thinking for 2 weeks about something she needs to say. She set the pie on the table. She looked at the north wall for a long time. She walked its length, touching the stacked face at intervals, the way a person assessed something structural, looking for gaps, for instability, for evidence of the theory's failure. She found none. I told you it was foolish, Grace said. I told you the children would have no room. You did, Wren said. I was wrong. Grace turned from the wall. Her voice was flat, not because the admission cost her nothing, but because she was not a woman who dressed difficult things in softer fabric than they warranted. Carl and I have been talking. We want to build one before next winter, if you'll show me the construction. Wren showed her. She drew the dimensions in the dirt of the floor with a stick. She explained the north placement, the reason for 4 feet depth rather than 2, the way the wood needed to be split to a consistent size for stable stacking, the importance of keeping the face of the wall accessible rather than burying it behind other storage. She did not know the formal science of it. She could not have explained in any terminology that a university man would recognize what was happening in the grain of those stacked oak pieces as they absorbed heat during the day and surrendered it slowly through the night. She knew the practice, which was the same knowledge rendered in a different language. Grace listened with the complete attention of a woman who intended to act on what she was hearing. She asked 3 precise questions, all of them practical. She would remember. Before she left, she paused in the doorway. Colt Harrigan, she said. He was a good young man. I know, Wren said, though she had never met him. It seems like that should matter more than it does. Grace put on her coat. The winter doesn't account for good. She rode south across the white ground toward her own farm, her own cabin, her own reckoning with what she had seen and what she intended to do about it before the cold came again. The word moved across Custer County the way useful knowledge always moved on the frontier person to person. Farm to farm carried in the specific and practical language of people who needed information they could act on. Not theory, not philosophy. What width, what wood, which wall? Wren answered every question anyone brought her without charge, without condition. It was not generosity she was operating from. It was the memory of Colt Harrigan's outstretched hand 18 feet from the wood that should have saved him. It was the understanding that the knowledge she had stumbled into through desperation could be the difference between that hand reaching and not reaching, and keeping that knowledge to herself in a county full of people who faced the same winter she did was not a choice she was capable of making. By the following autumn, 9 homesteads in Custer County had interior north wall stacks built before the first hard freeze. Caleb Drummond taught the method to 3 families who had arrived in the spring. New claimants optimistic about summer beginning their own reckoning with the arithmetic of Nebraska winter. He called it the inside stack when he explained it, which was practical, if not poetic. The name that persisted in the county, the name that passed through conversations, and the shorthand of people who had seen it, survived something that killed a strong young man with 7 cords was simpler. They called it Callaway's Wall. Wren herself never heard that name applied to it. She was too busy planting. She proved up her claim in 1892, 5 years to the month from when she had filed the paperwork with James's name on it. The county clerk who processed the final certification looked at her name on the completion documents with the expression of someone retrieving a memory he'd assumed would be filed under a different outcome. He stamped the papers without comment. The land was hers. Lena was 12 by then, with her mother's economy of motion and an instinct for how things fit together that expressed itself in the careful way she built everything she touched. When they added a second room to the cabin in 1893, Lena built that room's north wall first, before she framed anything else with the internal sleeve for the annual wood stack already incorporated into the framing. She had understood at 7, watching her mother measure that original north wall with outstretched arms, something about the relationship between a structure and the people it was meant to protect. Otto grew into the reader he had always threatened to become. He read everything Wren could get to the claim newspapers, almanacs, the county agricultural bulletins that arrived quarterly from Lincoln. He had questions about everything and the patience to run them down. He became in time the kind of man who understood that the most important questions were often the ones that the people around him had stopped asking because they assumed the answers were already settled. Caleb Drummond came for coffee on Sunday mornings through the 90s, riding the 3/4 mile from his farm with the unhurried regularity of a man who had decided something was worth his time. They talked about weather crops, the county's slow accumulation of people and services. They spoke in the plain, direct language of people who had between them a shorthand built from a particular kind of shared experience. The experience of being wrong about something important and then being honest about it. He died in 1903. Wren sat with him in the last days in the frame house he'd built years before she arrived and held his hand with the same steadiness she had brought to every hard thing this ground had asked of her. She buried him beside his wife in the small cemetery east of Broken Bow, in ground that had survived every winter since 1876. She stood at the grave after the others had gone and thought about what he had told her in August of 1887, the verdict delivered without cruelty, with complete certainty, with 13 winters of evidence behind it. He had been right with the information he had. The information she'd had was different. A dead woman's practice, a child's half-understood memory, the logic of desperation that had no conventional arithmetic to run on. She had never blamed him for being right with what he knew. He had never blamed her for being right with what she knew. That was the whole of it, the complete accounting between them. The north wall in the original cabin room, rebuilt every autumn, restacked each October with fresh-cut wood, she and Lena and Otto hauled from the loop, was still standing in 1918 when Wren Callaway died in her bed at 62. She had rebuilt it 30 times. Each time she stacked the first course along the north face, she pressed her palm to the log wall behind it, feeling the cold that the wood was about to displace. And she thought about a woman who had lived and died in the Virginia Hill Country and had known something about oak and warmth that the cold did not account for and never would. The wood holds the warmth, The warmth holds the cold at bay. The cold had killed Colt Harrigan 18 feet from his woodpile. It had killed 235 people in a single night across 2 territories. It had not killed Ren Calloway. It had not killed Lena or Otto. The winter of 1888 had done what it did to everyone equally: the strong, the prepared, the experienced, the young. It had not made exceptions for good intentions or correct methods or adequate cord feet stacked in conventional piles outside conventional cabins. It had not been persuaded by any arithmetic that ran along the lines that men like Caleb Drummond in their wisdom had been taught to calculate. It had been persuaded by a wall. A wall built inside a 12 by 16-foot cabin in Custer County, Nebraska, by a woman who had never split a log in her life before August of 1887, who had no money and no experience and no help and no choice, who had stacked 3 cords of oak against her north wall on the basis of a memory she'd been carrying since childhood without knowing she would ever need it. The wall stood. Everything it held stood with it.